Well, I want to talk with the man who was first on the scene with the Disney Orlando plan. You hear him every week on the Sports Bash with Mike Gill on Wednesdays here on 97.3 ESPN. Now he joins us here on Saturday, as all guests do, on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Keith Smith, Yahoo Sports, joins us now on 97.3 ESPN. Keith, how you doing on this Saturday?
I'm doing good, Josh. How are you?
Doing pretty good. So my first question before we get to anything else, I think this is the one question I have seen the most since all the news that just flew all over the place yesterday. Keith, why 22 teams?
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces in there. One is it's a revenue play. The more teams you bring back in, the more games that get played, the more games that get put on TV, closer you get to fulfilling those regional sports network contracts and the like. So that's part of it. The other piece is what the NBA did, along with some of the teams' proposals. They went back and looked historically and said, with the amount of games that were left, 15 to 17 games or so for most teams, that there was a precedent where teams that were as far back as 6 games back had made a run and made the playoffs. So that allowed them to comfortably say, well, we've seen this happen before, so we can add in the Washington Wizards in the Eastern Conference and the Phoenix Suns in the Western Conference. We get a couple more teams in the mix here, widens out our pool a little bit, and off we go. So it looks like that was a lot of what drove this decision to go to 22 teams when predominantly we had been hearing 20 teams. That was a kind of new one that came out of left field, but that seems to be the reasoning behind it.
Now, I spoke with Ben Golliver of the Washington Post yesterday, and I asked him the question I want to ask you as well. How much do you think the NBA looked at what the NHL came out with and said, you know, is that something we can do? Is that something that is logistically possible for us?
Yeah, I think there might have been a little bit of that. I think the NBA is doing that with some tweaks. It seems like the NHL is doing it more as a true playoffs where they're going to bring in some of those teams. Now, those teams, as far as I understand, and I may be wrong, I'm not a big hockey guy, but those teams are a lot more bunched up, and those teams going to 24 really got them to all the teams that were in playoff contention with their plan to get a real shot at this. So I think the NBA is looking at it and saying, well, we can bring in the teams that are in reasonable playoff contention, play some regular season games. It looks like it's going to be about 8 of them. Let things shake out where they go, and then off we go for the playoffs.
Now, you mentioned the regional sports networks just a bit earlier, Keith. Give the audience a little bit more of an explanation of why that is a factor, because we know that's a factor, for example, with baseball. There's a lot of money that comes from those regional sports networks in baseball. So what is the regional sports network situation with the NBA teams?
Yeah, every regional sports network has every NBA team has a contract with a regional sports network or an RSN. And those RSN deals, the vast majority of them are considered fully fulfilled when they have had the ability to broadcast as many as 70 NBA games. Now, most teams were somewhere between 63 and 67 games into their season, but some of those may have been national TV where the RSN was cut out of it. They don't all do simultaneous broadcasts when they're on national TV. Most of them do, but not every game is that way. So by getting to bring teams back, getting to that 70-game marker, that's when the vast majority of those would be fulfilled, and the NBA feels good about, all right, we did that. And that brings money into the system that otherwise might not come in. And this is a league that is going to be down revenue. They're already down significant revenue for this year. They know they're going to be down some revenue for next year because next year they're going to come in with either no fans in the buildings or there are far fewer fans than usual in the buildings. And that's something the NBA is very conscious of, is how do we get money coming back into a system that wasn't built to take these, massive, massive losses that they're looking at taking right now.
Keith Smith joining us here on the Boardwalk on the Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Yahoo Sports NBA. Make sure you're following him on Twitter at Keith Smith NBA. I mentioned earlier, you were the first one to come up with this Disney plan. So how does that marrying of, okay, we need to fulfill these financial obligations we have with television and advertising fit in with the Disney Wide World of Sports complex setup?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. One is Disney, through ESPN ABC, they get to broadcast a lot more games, and they have a lot of the playoff games. They have the NBA Finals. So really important for ESPN, ABC to get the league back and get live sports back on air. I mean, we're all seeing, things like Korean League baseball. People are getting up early in the morning just to watch live sports in this country because that's how much they miss it. So they would love to have that back. And then from the NBA side, of course, that allows them, again, to be on the air, fulfill some of those national TV deals, and get that money flowing back in. So it's really a pretty symbiotic relationship there of let's work together, there's good synergy, and let's get this thing moving.
One of the questions I had that I was thinking about this week, Keith, is that, one of the reasons why the NBA has the television set up, especially for the national broadcast games, is because of the markets these teams are in. So you're not going to ask the Lakers to play a game at 3 o'clock Pacific time. But now if all the teams are in one location, how does the fact that you're in one location factor into the timing of the broadcasting of these games?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So one thing that they can't do is there's only going to be, it sounds like, 2 game facilities available to them at a time, which that's the case, even at Summer League, there's only 2 game facilities available. So you could have 2 games going on at a time, but it sounds like they're going to time them out. If it's East Coast teams, they're going to play a little earlier in the day. If it's the small market teams that maybe people don't care so much about, they might play earlier in the day. And that's as you're finishing out this regular season. Then once you get into the playoffs, that's when they can lock into a much more traditional schedule where you're playing, generally there's 4 games Saturday, 4 games Sunday, each in their own window. That they can easily do at the ESPN Wide World of Sports complex. And then on the weeknights, there's anywhere from 2 to 4 games on a weeknight night, and that they'll do between the 2 courts. But they're going to put the West Coast teams in the West Coast time slots because one is that's fair to that fan base to get to see them. But the reality is that's also going to increase the rating and drive that up. And then you're going to see, just like they do in the playoffs, if it is a really compelling series, you bet that's going to get a prime national TV slot, especially on those weekend days where they can make that work. I don't think you're going to see the Lakers and Clippers playing too often at 12 noon Eastern, and people waking up and having their breakfast cereal watching the Lakers play on the West Coast. I don't think we're going to see very much of that.
Keith, when you were on the Sports Bash earlier this week, one of the things you brought up about is the fact that there's not going to be fans here. So there's technically no more home court advantage. And you mentioned, for example, teams like the Sixers and the Heat. One of the things I noticed with the Sixers and the Heat, these are 2 teams that have a very strong difference in their home versus away record. Whereas a team, for example, like the Raptors, they have an identical home and away record. So what is going to be the impact for the teams that, if they would have had home court advantage, it would have really benefited them? What kind of difference could we potentially see in the play of a team, for example, like the 76ers?
Yeah, I've been asking around the league to get an understanding of who does this neutral site environment benefit. And the answer has been it doesn't really necessarily benefit anybody. The one team that was thrown as it benefiting might be the Dallas Mavericks, who actually had been a better road team this year than a home team, which is kind of a rarity in the NBA. But they did say that there are a handful of teams that could be hurt by this. And they mentioned one thing they started with is younger teams. Younger teams tend to rely more on the crowd to lift them and do those things, where the veteran teams, they're a little bit more go out there, we do our business, doesn't matter where we play. Now, 2 teams specifically that were mentioned, you said it, the Miami Heat and the Philadelphia 76ers. And the reason they were mentioned is they have been very much better as home teams this year than they have been as road teams. They both have pretty miserable road records. Playoff teams. Philadelphia has the best home record in the NBA. And a specific player who was called out to me was a guy, it was Joel Embiid. And what the guy said was, Joel Embiid is a guy who plays to the crowd a lot. He feeds off that crowd energy. And he said, I think he's a guy who could be really impacted by not having those home fans to lift him. And I just did a podcast, so shout out to Morton Jensen on this one. And what Mort said is he pulled it up is Embiid's home road splits for this season. He is so much better of a player in Philadelphia than he is anywhere else. It's really kind of wild. So it lends a lot of credence to that theory that could be part of what drives why they're not as good a team on the road, and why that scout thinks that Embiid could be a guy who struggles in this neutral site environment.
So focusing on the Sixers and Embiid then, Is that purely just because, like you said, younger players, they feed off the crowd? Is that partially a maturity issue? Does that say something to the fact that, maybe the Sixers, they're talented, but their two young superstars, Embiid and Simmons, are not as far along in their development as maybe the expectations that have been placed upon them?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some of that. I think when they signed Al Horford, one of the things they talked about was his veteran mentality in the locker room and on the court, his playoff experience. That was continually mentioned as part of the reason why they wanted to get him. And I think that it's to offset the two young superstars in Simmons and Embiid, who they've been not those guys necessarily. They're young, and that's not necessarily a criticism of them. They're just young, and that takes a little while to get there in the NBA. We always see NBA teams, young NBA teams, they don't generally win their first run through the playoffs. They'll get in, they might win a round, but then they run into, generally it starts to get that much harder on them because they're not used to that grind. And I think when you really look at the numbers and put it all together, Philadelphia is a team that is, they're 29-2 at home this year. You can't doubt that. That's that's an incredible home record. But they're 10 and something on the road, 10 and not very good on the road, and that's tough to get past. And then when you specifically, I believe when we were talking about it earlier today, I think Embiid away from Philadelphia only shoots 43% from the field, and that's tough for a guy his size with his talent to see that. And I think that's definitely a room for concern and worry, is that they might not be as good away from Philadelphia, and clearly they're not going to be there for the remainder of this season.
Yeah, they're 10-24 on the road. 29 of the team's 39 wins of all at home. So if this is a team that, and forgive me for doing a little bit of connective tissue here, but if the Sixers are not as good away from home and the team has these high expectations, if they don't meet those expectations, this team has another second round playoff series loss. What does that mean for the future then?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, I think whether we had a normal season play out, if they flamed out earlier than anybody thought in the playoffs, first round or a non-competitive second round series or something like that, I think Brett Brown was going to ultimately be gone. And unfortunately, this year's been weird, and it's been, with this big pause, and now we're turning at a neutral site. But I do think that there's a good chance they're going to move in a different direction on the sidelines. It's just everything's been kind of slowly pointing to that. And the history of the NBA tells us, and it's a oft-used quote in the NBA, you can't fire the players and you can't fire the owner. So who do you fire? You fire the coach, and you move in a different direction that way. And I think that's where you're looking. I don't think they're going to do anything as far as splitting Simmons and Embiid yet. I think that's more of a let's get another year into this. Let's see what it looks like. Let's maybe get another more normal year under our belt and get there, but likely with a new coach. And then that's a decision point. You can start to have that conversation down the road.
What about the pressure that might be on Elton Brand? He's the third GM that's been here in the last several years. He's had constant roster turnover, not just in the offseason, but during the season in the last couple of years. And you have to wonder, how much did the current roster construction impact some of the problems the Sixers had this year? So no matter what happens, how much pressure could be on Elton Brand in this, what's expected to be what basically would be a 2-month offseason?
Yeah, there's going to be a lot. I think no matter what happens, he makes it through this year and into next year, and I think he'll be the one building next year's roster. But if next year's team underachieves to their expectations, I do think that they're going to start to look at, all right, maybe now we need to really look at the front office and rebuilding it as well, because not only have you built a roster that, this was a team that was on the rise and maybe they stagnated earlier than anybody thought, but now we're locked in long term to a couple of these guys that those contracts are a little bit questionable, and that makes it a little harder. Now, on the flip side, you may see the ownership look at it of, hey, you made this mess, you got to figure it out, because we're not going to pay you and pay somebody else to come in here and fix it while we're doing this with these guys. So that becomes that balancing point of, go out there and get it done. But I do think, what I don't expect from Philadelphia, or I at least hope, is maybe they make a change at the coaching position. But another year of big roster turnover and making big moves, it's just going to continually make it harder on this team. That I think is why they've been inconsistent, is as they've kind of come up and become this good team over the last couple of years, so much change makes it hard to really evaluate, gel, and know who they are as a group. So another big turnover of the roster, again, leading into next year, that's just going to make it that much harder, even if it is a brand new coach. And that if it is a brand new coach, it's even harder in some respects that way, too.
Keith, if there was one move the Sixers need to make this offseason, let's say Elton Brand picked up the phone and called you personally and said, Keith, what is a move that this team has to make to be better next year in terms of the roster?
That's a good question. I would probably lean more towards ride it out with what you have. I tried to bring back Alec Burks and Glenn Robinson III. I think those were important additions. I try to go out and find, maybe one more shooter. There's several shooters available on this year's market or expected to be available that could come fairly cheap. I think that's, one of the things that they're just lacking is another guy who can come in and you can really trust the knockdown shots. But I wouldn't make big changes. I would, kind of see it through. You had a vision for it. Now let it see through and see what it looks like, and hopefully things come together with a full year of everybody being together. Maybe everything looks a little bit better, but it'd be tweaks around the edges versus any big, massive, wild swing that really are making over this team.
He is Keith Smith. Follow him on Twitter at Keith Smith NBA, Yahoo Sports NBA, Real GM, and as all guests, he appeared on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. You catch him every week on the Sports Special with Mike Gill on Wednesdays here on 97.3 ESPN. Keith, appreciate the weekend appearance and have a good weekend.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate it. You stay safe, you and yours.